Get off my plane or I will have you dragged off in handcuffs. The pilot's voice boomed over the intercom, humiliating the woman in seat 2A, but Diana Crawford didn't scream, didn't fight, didn't beg. She simply adjusted her hoodie, looked Captain Hayes in the eye and whispered 3 words that would cost the airline everything. "You'll regret this." They laughed as police hauled her away like a criminal, thinking she was just another uppity passenger in the wrong seat. But they didn't know that the woman they just assaulted wasn't just a passenger. She was the owner of the $4 billion contract keeping their airline from bankruptcy, and she was about to cancel it. The recycled air inside the cabin of Horizon Airways Flight 247 smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, a scent Diana Crawford usually associated with progress and the countless flights she'd taken building her logistics empire from nothing. Today, however, it just smelled like exhaustion, the kind that seeps into your bones after 36 hours of brutal negotiations in Tokyo, where she'd just closed a merger that would add 10 zeros to her net worth and give Crawford Logistics control of shipping routes across the entire Pacific Rim. Diana adjusted the strap of her battered canvas messenger bag as she stepped onto the plush blue carpet of first class, her body moving with the unconscious authority of someone who had commanded boardrooms and hostile takeover meetings for 15 years. She was dressed for comfort, not conquest. An oversized, charcoal gray hoodie that had seen better days, black leggings that allowed her to curl up properly during the long flight ahead, and worn-out sneakers that had carried her through countless airport terminals around the world. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun secured with what looked like a cheap elastic band, and she wore 0 makeup, her face showing every hour of the exhaustion that came from closing deals that would reshape entire industries. To the casual observer glancing at her as she made her way down the aisle, she looked like a college student heading home for the weekend, or perhaps an overworked graduate student who'd spent too many nights in the library. Certainly not like someone who owned the largest logistics company on the West Coast, or someone whose signature appeared on contracts worth more than most small countries' annual budgets. But if you knew what to look for, the signs were there. The way she moved with quiet confidence through the space, never doubting she belonged there. The expensive dental work that flashed when she smiled politely at other passengers, and the watch on her wrist that looked like a simple fitness tracker, but was actually a custom piece worth more than most people's cars. She found seat 2A, the prime spot she'd specifically chosen and paid nearly $10,000 for at the last minute. A window seat with maximum privacy in the bulkhead row where she could stretch out her long legs and nurse the old basketball injury in her left knee that still bothered her during long flights. It was an extravagant expense for a 6-hour flight, but Diana had learned long ago that rest was not a luxury, but a necessity when you were responsible for the livelihoods of 12,000 employees and the supply chains that kept half the Fortune 500 companies operational. As she moved to slide her canvas bag into the overhead bin, making sure not to disturb the expensive luggage already stored there, a hand with perfectly manicured red nails shot out like a snake strike, blocking her path with enough force to make her step back slightly. "Excuse me," came a sharp voice that cut through the ambient noise of passengers settling into their seats, a voice that carried the particular brand of condescension that service workers sometimes wielded like a weapon against people they deemed unworthy of respect. Diana paused and looked down to see a flight attendant whose name tag read Ashley Chen, staring at her with a tight artificial smile that didn't reach her cold eyes, which were already scanning Diana's appearance with the kind of judgment usually reserved for people who'd committed actual crimes. Ashley was immaculately groomed, her uniform pressed to military precision, her makeup applied with the skill of someone who understood that appearance was everything in customer service. But her posture radiated the kind of hostility that came from someone having a very bad day and looking for someone safe to take it out on. "Economy boarding is through the next aisle," Ashley said, her voice dripping with condescension as she pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward the back of the plane, not even bothering to look Diana in the face anymore, dismissing her entirely as someone who clearly didn't belong in this section of the aircraft. "You're blocking the flow for our actual first-class passengers, and we need to maintain order during the boarding process. So if you could just move along, that would be great." Diana blinked slowly, processing the assumption and the dismissal, too tired from her marathon negotiation session to feel the immediate anger that might have surfaced if she'd been more alert, but certainly awake enough to recognize discrimination when she encountered it. "I know where economy is," she said, her voice carrying just a hint of the authority she wielded in boardrooms, though it was muffled by fatigue and the rasp that came from too many hours of presentations and phone calls. "I'm in seat 2A, and I'd like to store my bag and sit down, please." She made to lift her bag toward the overhead compartment again, but Ashley physically stepped in front of her, blocking the narrow aisle with her body and creating a human barrier that forced other passengers to wait behind them, some of whom were beginning to notice the confrontation with the mixture of curiosity and discomfort that characterized most airplane disputes. The smile vanished completely from Ashley's face, replaced by something harder and more openly hostile. The mask of professional courtesy slipping to reveal the frustration and judgment underneath. "Let's not play games here, sweetheart." Ashley snapped, her voice rising just loud enough for the passengers settling into seats, 3A and 3B to hear clearly, drawing their attention to what was clearly becoming a situation. "This is first class, and it's reserved for paying customers who bought full-fare tickets, not for people looking for free upgrades because they smiled at the gate agent or because they think they deserve special treatment." Ashley held out her hand with the imperial gesture of someone accustomed to having her authority unquestioned fingers extended in expectation. "Let me see your boarding pass right now, and we can clear up this confusion before it becomes a bigger problem for everyone involved." Diana sighed a long, weary exhalation that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. The sound of someone who had dealt with this particular brand of prejudice more times than she cared to count throughout her career in the predominantly white, predominantly male world of logistics and technology. She reached into the front pocket of her hoodie and pulled out the crumpled paper boarding pass, handing it over with the patient resignation of someone who knew the drill but was too tired to fight it in the moment. Ashley snatched the boarding pass from her fingers, as if it might be contaminated, her eyes scanning the printed information with the desperate intensity of someone hoping to find a mistake that would justify her assumptions and her behavior. She frowned deeply as she read the clearly printed text, Crawford Diana. "Seat 2A, Priority 1, First Class." The evidence was undeniable. But rather than apologizing for her error, Ashley's expression grew even more hostile, as if Diana had somehow tricked her by having a legitimate ticket. "There must be some kind of system error," Ashley muttered more to herself than to Diana, handing the boarding pass back with just 2 fingers, as if the paper itself were somehow contaminated by association. These things happen sometimes with the computer booking systems, but regardless of what this says, that overhead bin space is reserved for standard first-class luggage, not for gym bags and personal items that should be stored under the seat. "It fits perfectly fine," Diana replied calmly, her voice carrying the patience of someone who had learned long ago that escalating these situations only made them worse, though there was a note of firmness creeping in that suggested her patience was not infinite. "And according to my ticket, I have priority boarding status, which means I have the same rights to overhead storage as any other passenger in this section. It's an eyesore." Ashley hissed, her professional mask completely gone, now replaced by naked contempt for this woman who dared to challenge her judgment and her authority. "Put it under the seat in front of you, where it belongs, and we can all move on with our lives." Diana didn't argue further, recognizing a battle that couldn't be won in the moment and knowing she had bigger concerns than overhead bin politics. She just wanted to sit down, close her eyes, and try to recover from the marathon of negotiations that had left her feeling like she'd been hit by a truck. She shoved the canvas bag under the seat in front of her, which was difficult given the bulkhead configuration that left limited legroom immediately cramping the space around her injured knee and making what should have been a comfortable flight position into something that would cause her pain for the next 6 hours. She buckled her seatbelt, closed her eyes, and put on her noise-canceling headphones, trying to signal to the world that she was done with the conversation and ready to get some much-needed rest before landing in New York, where she had meetings scheduled that would determine the future direction of several major infrastructure projects. She thought the ordeal was over, that she could finally get the piece she'd paid $10,000 to secure, but she was wrong about that in ways she couldn't have imagined. 5 minutes later, as she was finally starting to drift toward the edge of sleep, a heavy thud against her shoulder jolted her back to full consciousness with the kind of rude awakening that immediately set her nerves on edge. "You're in my spot," came a voice from above her, dripping with the kind of entitlement that could only come from someone who had never been told no in his entire privileged life. Diana slid her headphones down around her neck and looked up to see a man who looked like he had been manufactured in a factory specifically designed to produce entitled executives, someone whose very presence seemed to demand that the world rearrange itself to accommodate his preferences and his schedule. He was tall and imposing, wearing a bespoke navy suit that probably cost more than most people made in 6 months. His blonde hair slicked back with the kind of precision that suggested a team of stylists and a jawline that clenched with irritation at having to deal with what he clearly considered a problem beneath his notice. Behind him stood Ashley, but her entire demeanor had transformed completely, her hostile expression replaced by a look of apologetic concern that was almost embarrassing in its desperation to please. Where she had been sharp and dismissive with Diana, she was now practically fawning over this new arrival, her voice already taking on the syrupy tone reserved for people she recognized as important. "Excuse me?" Diana asked, genuinely confused about what was happening and why this stranger thought he had any claim to her seat, especially given that she had a confirmed ticket and had been sitting there peacefully for several minutes. "I said you're in my spot." The man repeated his voice, carrying the imperial tone of someone who expected immediate compliance with his demands and still not bothering to look directly at Diana, instead addressing his complaint to Ashley, as if Diana were merely an obstacle to be removed rather than a person deserving of basic respect. "You know, I always book seats 2A and 2B for my overseas flights. Ashley and I need the space for my equipment and my comfort items." He gestured broadly toward a large, hard-shell case that clearly contained some kind of musical instrument, along with 2 expensive-looking garment bags that he'd apparently dumped onto seat 2B, without any consideration for other passengers or proper storage procedures. The case alone was taking up enough space for 3 people, and it was clear he expected the entire row to be cleared for his personal use. "Mr. Whitmore, I am so incredibly sorry about this mix-up." Ashley cooed, her voice transforming into something Diana barely recognized as coming from the same person who had been so hostile moments earlier, the contrast so stark it was almost comedic. "There seems to have been some kind of confusion at the gate level, and this passenger insists she has a legitimate ticket for your usual seat." Diana stiffened as she recognized the name and the face pieces clicking into place in her memory of financial news coverage and business profiles she'd read over the years. Brandon Whitmore was a hedge fund manager she'd seen on various financial news networks, usually pontificating about market trends with the kind of confidence that came from inherited wealth rather than earned expertise, and almost always wrong about his predictions, but never short on arrogance about his opinions. "I don't care what she claims to have," Brandon said, finally deigning to look down at Diana with a sneer of disgust that made it clear he found her very presence in first class to be personally offensive to his sensibilities. "Just look at her. She looks like she crawled out of a dumpster behind some college campus, and honestly, does she even have shoes that match God? And what is that smell? It's like she hasn't showered in a week." Diana was wearing clean, albeit worn sneakers that had carried her through airports around the world, and she smelled like the expensive hotel soap from her suite in Tokyo. But Brandon wasn't reacting to reality. He was reacting to his own prejudices and assumptions about who belonged in spaces like first class and who didn't, making judgments based on clothing and appearance rather than any actual evidence. Ma'am, Ashley said, tapping Diana on the shoulder with enough force to make her wince, the physical contact crossing a line that made Diana's patience begin to evaporate completely. Mr. Whitmore is a Diamond Medallion member with Horizon Airways, and he's been booking these specific seats for over 5 years for his international travel needs. We really need you to move to accommodate his established travel patterns and his membership status. I have a confirmed ticket that I paid for. Diana said, her voice hardening as she felt the familiar cold clarity that came over her in hostile negotiations, the sleepiness fading and being replaced by the sharp focus that had made her one of the most feared deal-makers on the West Coast. I paid full price for this seat, and I am not moving for anyone regardless of their membership status or their personal preferences. Brandon laughed, a harsh barking sound that contained no humor whatsoever, the kind of laugh that was meant to humiliate rather than express amusement. You paid for this with what exactly? Food stamps? Maybe some kind of government assistance program? Or did you find someone's lost wallet in the airport bathroom? A few passengers in the surrounding seats chuckled nervously, the kind of uncomfortable laughter that people make when they witness something cruel but don't want to get involved, while others looked away entirely unwilling to engage with the obvious injustice playing out right in front of them. I paid with an American Express Centurion card. Diana said, her voice low and controlled, but carrying an edge that anyone who knew her in business settings would recognize as a warning sign that she was reaching the end of her patience. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going back to sleep, and I suggest you find your actual assigned seats and stop harassing paying customers. She started to put her headphones back on, but Brandon's face turned an alarming shade of red, his carefully maintained composure cracking to reveal the spoiled child underneath the expensive suit. He turned to Ashley with the imperious gesture of someone accustomed to having service workers solve his problems without question. "Get the captain down here right now," Brandon demanded, his voice rising loud enough that passengers throughout the first-class cabin could hear every word clearly. "I am not flying with this kind of disruption sitting next to me for 6 hours. It's clearly a security risk, and just look at her behavior. She's probably on drugs or having some kind of mental health crisis." Ashley nodded vigorously, her eagerness to please this clearly important passenger overriding any concern she might have had about treating Diana fairly or following proper procedures. "Right away, Mr. Whitmore. I won't let your flight experience be ruined by this kind of situation, and we'll get this resolved immediately." Diana watched through half-closed eyes as Ashley marched purposefully toward the cockpit, her stride carrying the urgency of someone on a mission to solve a problem that threatened the comfort of a valued customer. The plane was fully boarded now, passengers settling in for the long flight ahead doors about to close, but the tension in the recycled air was thickening and turning electric with the sense that something significant was about to happen. Diana knew exactly how these situations typically played out. She had seen the viral videos, studied the statistics, and understood the dynamics that led to passengers being forcibly removed from aircraft for the crime of not fitting someone else's idea of who belonged in premium seating. But she also knew exactly who she was and what kind of power she wielded in the world, even if it wasn't immediately visible to the people judging her by her clothes and her appearance. She reached into her pocket and touched her phone, not unlocking it yet, but feeling the solid weight of the device that connected her to an empire built on contracts and relationships that these people couldn't begin to imagine. She didn't activate anything yet. She was waiting, watching, letting them commit to their course of action before she revealed her hand, because she needed them to cross the line from rudeness into something legally actionable. The cockpit door opened with the mechanical precision of aircraft engineering, and Captain Robert Hayes stepped out into the passenger cabin like a man entering a courtroom where he expected to deliver judgment. He was a large man with silver hair and the 4 stripes on his shoulders that marked him as the ultimate authority on this aircraft, carrying the weight of his position. Like a club, he was prepared to use against anyone who challenged his decisions or disrupted his flight schedule. He didn't look like someone interested in mediation or hearing multiple sides of a story. He looked like someone who wanted to identify a problem, remove it efficiently, and get his aircraft off the ground on time so he could maintain the perfect safety and punctuality record that he took pride in after 20 years of flying commercial aircraft for major airlines. Ashley whispered urgently in Captain Hayes's ear, pointing a manicured finger directly at Diana while speaking in the kind of hushed conspiratorial tone that suggested she was reporting a genuine threat rather than a seating dispute. Brandon stood nearby with his arms crossed, checking his expensive Rolex watch and tapping his foot with the impatience of someone whose time was worth more than other people's dignity, looking bored and superior while waiting for the problem to be solved to his satisfaction. Captain Hayes adjusted his cap with the gesture of someone preparing to exercise authority and loomed over seat 2A with the physical presence of someone accustomed to having passengers defer to his commands without question. Ma'am Hayes boomed, not bothering to use the polite customer service voice that airlines trained their staff to employ, instead using the commanding tone he might use with a subordinate crew member who had violated safety protocols. "I need you to gather your belongings immediately and step off this aircraft right now. This is not a request, it's a direct order from the flight crew." Diana removed her headphones slowly and deliberately, making it clear she was giving him her full attention while also demonstrating that she was not going to be rushed or intimidated by his aggressive approach. She didn't stand up from her seat, didn't make any sudden movements that could be interpreted as threatening, and kept her hands visible and resting calmly on her knees in a position that any reasonable observer would recognize as completely non-threatening. Why, she asked simply, her voice carrying no challenge or hostility, just a straightforward request for information about why she was being asked to leave an aircraft when she had a valid ticket and had done nothing wrong. "We have an overbooking situation." Hayes lied, the falsehood so clumsy and obvious that anyone paying attention would immediately recognize it as fabricated, since the plane was clearly not full and there were empty seats visible throughout the cabin. "And Mr. Whitmore has priority status with our airline, so we need to accommodate his luggage requirements and his seating preferences." "I don't want a voucher or a different seat," Diana said calmly, her voice carrying the patience of someone explaining something to a child, though there was a note of steel underneath that suggested she was not as compliant as her tone might suggest. "I'm not moving for a cello case, and I have a confirmed paid ticket for this exact seat. Denying me boarding at this stage after I've already been seated and settled would be a violation of federal aviation regulations unless I represent some kind of genuine safety threat." She paused, looking directly into Hayes' eyes with the kind of steady gaze that made it clear she knew exactly what she was talking about and wasn't going to be intimidated by his uniform or his authority. "Am I a threat to flight safety?" Captain Hayes's face flushed a deep angry red that suggested he was not accustomed to having passengers quote federal regulations at him or challenge his authority with such calm confidence. He wasn't used to dealing with passengers who understood their rights and were prepared to assert them in the face of clear discrimination and abuse of power. "You are becoming a threat by disobeying direct orders from the flight crew." Hayes spat, his voice rising loud enough that passengers throughout the first-class cabin could hear every word of the confrontation. "This is my aircraft, and I have absolute authority over who flies and who doesn't, and you are disrupting the peace and comfort of our premium passengers with your attitude and your refusal to cooperate." She was aggressive and threatening from the moment she boarded. Ashley chimed in from behind the captain, her voice carrying the false urgency of someone adding fuel to a fire that was already burning out of control. "She told me she was going to take me down and make me pay for disrespecting her. It was clearly a threat of violence against crew members. It was a blatant, easily disproven lie, and Diana looked at Ashley with the kind of steady gaze that memorized details for future legal proceedings, filing away the name and the face and the exact words for the depositions and court appearances that would inevitably follow this incident. I said nothing of the sort Diana stated calmly and clearly, her voice carrying into the cabin where several passengers had pulled out their phones and were discreetly recording the interaction. I simply asked to sit in the seat I purchased, and I've been nothing but polite throughout this entire interaction. I don't have time for this kind of disruption, Brandon groaned dramatically, throwing his hands up in the air with the theatrical gesture of someone performing for an audience. Captain, either get her off this plane right now or I'm walking, and if I walk away from this flight, Horizon Airways loses the entire corporate account for Whitmore Holdings. And trust me, you can do the math on what that means for your bottom line. That was the trigger the moment when the situation shifted from a customer service issue to a financial calculation, and Captain Hayes made his choice based on which passenger he thought was worth more to the airline's profit margins. The math seemed simple to him. Keep the Diamond Medallion member with the corporate account happy. Remove the problem passenger in the hoodie who probably flew once a year and wouldn't be missed. Ma'am, this is your final warning, Hayes said, leaning in close enough that Diana could smell the coffee on his breath and see the broken capillaries around his nose that suggested he had his own personal demons to deal with. Leave voluntarily right now, or I will call airport security and have you forcibly removed from this aircraft. You'll be placed on our no-fly list permanently, and you'll be arrested for criminal trespassing. Is that really what you want to happen here? Diana looked around the cabin at the faces of her fellow passengers, some sympathetic, some uncomfortable, some actively filming with their phones, and some just looking away because they didn't want to get involved in someone else's problem. She took a deep breath, thinking about her grandmother's words about dignity and grace under pressure, thinking about the empire she'd built and the responsibility she had to use her power wisely. I am not moving, Diana stated clearly, her voice carrying throughout the cabin so that everyone present could hear her exact words and her calm demeanor. You are discriminating against me based on my appearance and Mr. Whitmore's personal preferences, and this is illegal under federal civil rights law. That's it? Hayes snapped his patience, finally exhausted by this passenger's refusal to be intimidated or bullied into compliance. He turned to the gate agent who had appeared in the aircraft doorway drawn by the commotion and the delay in departure. Call security immediately, Hayes ordered with the authority of someone accustomed to having his commands followed without question. Tell them we have a belligerent passenger refusing to deplane voluntarily. Make it a level 2 response because she's shown signs of physical resistance and verbal aggression toward crew members. Level 2 implied the possibility of physical force and violent resistance, painting Diana as a dangerous threat when anyone watching could see she had remained completely calm and cooperative throughout the entire interaction. Hayes was escalating the situation and setting the stage for whatever violence might follow, creating a narrative that would justify whatever force security felt was necessary to remove her from the aircraft. The cabin went silent except for the hiss of the air conditioning system and the distant sound of ground crew working around the aircraft, 10 agonizing minutes of tension, during which Diana sat perfectly still while Brandon smugly settled into seat 2B, deliberately bumping his knee against Diana's leg and texting on his phone with the satisfied expression of someone who had gotten his way through intimidation and bullying. Then came the heavy tread of boots echoing on the jet bridge. The sound every passenger dreads because it means a situation has escalated beyond the point of reasonable resolution and into the realm of law enforcement and potential violence. 2 officers squeezed through the aircraft door and into the first-class cabin, their utility belts and equipment making the narrow aisle feel even more cramped and oppressive, their presence immediately changing the atmosphere from tense to genuinely threatening. The older officer looked tired and world-weary, like someone who had dealt with too many of these situations, and just wanted to get through his shift without paperwork or complications, while his younger partner had the eager, aggressive energy of someone looking to prove himself through decisive action. "Where's the problem?" passenger demanded Officer Kevin Torres, his hand already resting on his belt in a gesture that suggested he expected resistance and was prepared to use whatever force he deemed necessary to resolve the situation quickly and efficiently. Right there, in seat 2, A. Ashley pointed at Diana as if she were indicating a dangerous animal that needed to be contained, her voice carrying the kind of urgency usually reserved for genuine emergencies. "She's been intoxicated and belligerent since boarding, refusing direct orders from the flight crew and making threats against airline personnel." "I haven't consumed any alcohol in 3 days," Diana said clearly and calmly, her voice carrying to the other passengers who were watching this interaction with growing discomfort and concern. "And I haven't made any threats against anyone. I simply asked to sit in the seat I paid for." "Ma'am, I need you to stand up right now," Officer Torres barked, without asking any questions about the situation or attempting to understand what had actually transpired. Simply seeing a flight crew, a well-dressed businessman, and an expensive aircraft all pointing at a black woman in casual clothes as the source of the problem. He had made his assessment based on appearances and social cues rather than facts or evidence, falling back on the training and instincts that told him to trust authority figures and remove problems quickly rather than investigate complex situations that might delay flights and create complications for everyone involved. "I have a legal right to be here," Diana said, maintaining her composure despite the escalating situation and the growing sense that this was about to become physically violent regardless of her cooperation or compliance. "I am the CEO of Crawford Logistics, and I purchased this ticket legally, and I haven't violated any laws or airline policies. I don't care if you're the Queen of England." Torres interrupted, reaching out and grabbing Diana's arm with enough force to make her wince in pain, his grip immediately too tight and too aggressive for someone who posed no physical threat to anyone in the vicinity. "You're trespassing on private property, and you're going to come with us right now whether you cooperate or not." "Don't touch me," Diana said instinctively, flinching away from the painful grip, but Torres interpreted her natural reaction to unwanted physical contact as resistance to his lawful authority. "She's resisting," Torres shouted loud enough for everyone in the cabin to hear, creating a justification for whatever level of force he was about to use against a woman who was clearly not fighting back or posing any kind of physical threat to anyone. What happened next unfolded in a blur of violence that would be replayed millions of times on social media and news broadcasts around the world. Torres yanked Diana out of her seat with such force that her injured knee twisted painfully, and her hip slammed against the armrest hard enough to leave bruises that would be visible for weeks afterward. Her canvas bag fell from her lap, spilling papers, and her tablet onto the floor of the aircraft, the contents of her professional life scattered like debris. "My bag," Diana cried out, reaching instinctively for her belongings, but Captain Hayes shouted over her from his position near the cockpit. "Leave it! Get her off my aircraft immediately." Officer Torres twisted Diana's arm behind her back with unnecessary force, applying a restraint technique designed for violent criminals rather than cooperative passengers, creating sharp, white-hot pain that shot through her shoulder and down her arm as ligaments stretched beyond their natural limits. The pain was immediate and excruciating, but Diana forced herself not to cry out, knowing that any sound of distress would be used to justify even more violence against her. She was marched down the narrow aisle of first class like a perp walk, every passenger watching as she was paraded past them in handcuffs, some looking away in embarrassment, others filming with their phones, and a few shaking their heads in disgust at what they were witnessing, but not willing to intervene on behalf of a stranger. "You people always think you own the place," Brandon sneered as Diana was dragged past his seat, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who felt completely safe expressing his true feelings, because he knew there would be no consequences for his words or actions. He even kicked her spilled bag out of his way, with deliberate malice scattering her papers further across the cabin floor. Have fun in county jail, he added with a laugh that contained no warmth or humanity whatsoever. Diana didn't struggle against the restraints or fight back against the officers, knowing from years of watching viral videos and reading news reports that any resistance, no matter how justified, would be used to escalate the violence against her and justify whatever force they chose to use. She let them drag her, let them humiliate her, let them treat her like a criminal, because she understood that her dignity lay not in fighting back, but in maintaining her composure while they revealed their true character to the world. As they reached the door of the aircraft, Diana managed to turn her head back one last time, making eye contact with Captain Hayes, who was straightening his tie and looking satisfied with how he had handled what he clearly considered a minor disruption to his flight schedule. "Captain Hayes," she said, her voice cutting through the commotion and carrying clearly throughout the first-class cabin, ensuring that everyone present would remember her exact words. "My name is Diana Crawford. I suggest you remember that name." Hayes laughed dismissively, waving his hand as if brushing away an annoying insect that had briefly interrupted his day. "Get her out of here before she delays my departure any further." They pushed her roughly onto the jet bridge, the cold, recycled air hitting her face like a slap, and the handcuffs clicked onto her wrists with the finality of metal biting into skin. As they marched her up the ramp toward the terminal, past curious ground crew and gate agents who stared at the unusual sight of a passenger being arrested before takeoff, Diana didn't cry or beg or protest her innocence. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was beginning to fade, replaced by a cold, calculating fury that settled into her bones like winter, and she wasn't thinking about bail money or legal fees or even the humiliation of being treated like a criminal in front of dozens of witnesses. She was thinking about Project Icarus, the code name for the massive infrastructure overhaul that Horizon Airways was currently implementing to modernize their entire operational system, a $4 billion contract that would determine whether the airline survived the next decade or filed for bankruptcy within the year. The vendor providing all of that critical technology, the logistics coordination, the cargo tracking the crew, scheduling, the fuel optimization, every single system that kept Horizon's planes in the air and on schedule, was Crawford Logistics, and Diana Crawford was the sole signatory on that contract, which included a very specific clause that most airlines ignored because they never imagined it would be relevant to their situation. Clause 14B was the reputational harm and ethics provision carefully crafted by her legal team to protect Crawford Logistics from being associated with companies that engaged in conduct that violated the company's core values of dignity, respect, and equal treatment for all people. It gave the vendor the right to terminate the agreement immediately without penalty or warning if the client engaged in behavior that brought disrepute to the vendor or violated basic standards of human decency. Diana smiled as they pushed her toward the airport detention facility, and it was a terrifying expression that combined cold calculation with righteous fury in a way that would have made anyone who saw it realize they had made a catastrophic mistake. "Why are you smiling?" Officer Torres asked, shoving her roughly toward the holding area, genuinely confused by her reaction because most people he arrested were crying or begging or angry, not looking like they had just figured out the solution to a complicated puzzle. "You think this is funny? You think getting arrested is some kind of joke?" "No," Diana whispered, her voice carrying a certainty that made Torres feel unexpectedly uneasy, though he couldn't quite understand why. "I just realized I'm about to save $4 billion. The holding cell at Terminal 4 was a monument to institutional indifference, a 10 by 10 concrete box painted in a shade of beige that seemed specifically chosen to drain hope from anyone unfortunate enough to be confined within its walls. The smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with human desperation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and there was a single metal bench bolted to the wall that was cold enough to leach body heat through clothing and into bones within minutes of sitting down. Officer Torres shoved Diana inside and slammed the heavy steel door with the kind of force that suggested he took personal satisfaction in the sound of metal striking metal, the echo ringing in her ears like a bell tolling for someone's funeral. The small reinforced window in the door was positioned at eye level for someone much taller than Diana, forcing her to crane her neck to see the corridor beyond a small but deliberate humiliation designed to remind prisoners of their powerlessness. "Sit tight and think about your choices." Torres sneered through the thick glass, his face distorted by the layers of security glazing between them. "Processing takes a while around here, especially for Jane Does, who refuse to properly identify themselves to law enforcement officers." "I told you my name multiple times," Diana said calmly, leaning against the cold concrete wall and cradling her injured shoulder, which was now throbbing with a steady rhythmic pain that synchronized with her heartbeat and suggested something more serious than a simple strain. "Diana Crawford, CEO of Crawford Logistics." "Yeah, sure. And I'm Michael Jordan." Torres laughed, the sound echoing down the institutional corridor as his footsteps faded into the distance. "We'll run you through the system when it's convenient, but computers are running slow today, so you might be here a while. Hope you're comfortable." Diana closed her eyes and forced herself to breathe steadily, using the same meditation techniques she had learned during the most stressful periods of building her company when hostile takeover attempts and corporate sabotage had threatened everything she had worked to create. Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 4, exhale for 4. The rhythm of a predator waiting in tall grass, conserving energy for the moment when decisive action would be required. She needed her phone, which had been confiscated, along with her wallet, her belt, and anything else that might theoretically be used as a weapon or means of communication with the outside world, cutting her off from the empire she had spent 15 years building from nothing. But Diana Crawford had built that empire by anticipating failure points and preparing contingencies for situations that other people couldn't imagine, because she understood that power meant nothing if you couldn't access it when you needed it most. She looked at the digital watch on her wrist, which appeared to be a simple runner's watch worth maybe $50, the kind of basic fitness tracker that someone might wear during airport travel to count steps and monitor heart rate. She had deliberately chosen it over her usual Cartier timepiece before the Tokyo trip to avoid attracting pickpockets on public transportation, but the unremarkable appearance concealed sophisticated technology that most people would never suspect. Diana pressed the side buttons in a specific sequence that she had practiced dozens of times, but never hoped to use top button twice. Bottom button once, then hold both simultaneously for 3 seconds. The watch face flashed red briefly, sending an encrypted distress signal with her GPS coordinates to a private security firm in Manhattan that specialized in executive protection and emergency response for high-net-worth individuals who found themselves in situations where conventional help might not be available quickly enough. The signal went directly to Jonathan Pierce, who wasn't just her attorney, but had been her closest friend since law school, back when they were both scholarship students determined to prove that they belonged in rooms full of people who had inherited their opportunities. Jonathan had lost his left leg below the knee during his second tour in Afghanistan, but he had channeled his warrior instincts into the practice of law with the kind of fierce intensity that made him one of the most feared litigators on the East Coast. While Diana waited in her concrete box, fighting off the institutional cold and the growing pain in her shoulder, the world outside was catching fire in ways that none of the people who had humiliated her could have anticipated. The young couple sitting in seats 3A and 3B, Maya Rodriguez and Jordan Kim, were influencers with a modest but engaged following of about 50,000 subscribers across various social media platforms, and they had recorded the entire incident from boarding to arrest with the professional quality that came from years of creating content. They weren't just casual observers who happened to catch something dramatic on their phones. They were storytellers who understood how to frame injustice in ways that would resonate with audiences and drive engagement. And they had captured not just the violence of the arrest, but the entire arc of discrimination and escalation that led to it. They posted the video to TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube simultaneously, with a caption that cut straight to the heart of the matter. Horizon Airways assaults peaceful passenger for sitting while black. This is America in 2024. Share this before they try to bury it. At 2:15 p.m., the video had 400 views, mostly friends and family members of Maya and Jordan who followed their travel content regularly. At 2:30 p.m., it had crossed 15,000 views as the algorithm picked up on the rapid engagement and started pushing it to users who might be interested in social justice content. At 2:45 p.m., a prominent civil rights activist with over 3 million followers retweeted the video with the comment, "This is exactly why we can't stop fighting. Dignity is not negotiable and this woman deserved better." The algorithm woke up like a sleeping dragon, opening its eyes and smelling blood in the water, pushing the video to millions of users across multiple platforms, each view generating more outrage and more shares, creating the kind of viral momentum that could destroy reputations and end careers within hours of reaching critical mass. Inside the precinct, Sergeant Mike Kowalski was sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug and trying to finish paperwork from the morning shift, when the phone on his desk rang with the distinctive tone that meant someone important was calling. It wasn't the internal line that rang constantly with routine business, but the red phone that was reserved for the mayor's office, the governor's staff, and the kind of emergencies that could end careers if they weren't handled properly. Kowalski frowned and picked up the receiver, expecting to hear about a traffic accident or a security threat that would require coordination between multiple agencies. "Precinct 4, Sergeant Kowalski speaking. This is Commissioner O'Malley," came a voice that sounded like gravel being processed through a meat grinder, the kind of authority that made veteran cops straighten their posture even when they were alone in their offices. "Do you currently have a prisoner named Diana Crawford in your custody?" Kowalski blinked and scrolled through the arrest log on his computer screen, scanning the names of people who had been brought in during the day shift. We have a Jane Doe who refused to properly identify herself, claimed to be some kind of CEO, but she wouldn't provide proper documentation." "You absolute idiot!" Commissioner O'Malley screamed so loud that Kowalski had to hold the receiver away from his ear to avoid permanent hearing damage. "That woman is Diana Crawford, CEO of Crawford Logistics, the company that handles supply chain management for half the city's critical infrastructure, including our medical emergency response system. Do you have any idea who is currently screaming at the mayor because Diana Crawford is sitting in your jail cell?" The blood drained from Kowalski's face as he began to understand the magnitude of the mistake that had been made, not just by his officers, but by the entire chain of command that had allowed this situation to escalate to the point where one of the most powerful business leaders on the East Coast was being treated like a common criminal. "Sir, I can explain." "You can't explain anything." O'Malley cut him off, his voice carrying the kind of fury that ended careers and destroyed pensions. "Get down there. Get her out of that cell and apologize before I come down there personally and rip the badges off everyone involved in this disaster. And pray to whatever God you believe in that she doesn't sue us into bankruptcy." Kowalski dropped the phone and turned to stare at Officer Torres, who was standing by the water cooler eating a donut with the satisfied expression of someone who thought he had successfully completed a routine arrest without complications or paperwork problems. The contrast between Torres's casual confidence and the panic that was now spreading through the precinct like wildfire was almost surreal. Torres Kowalski whispered, his voice trembling with the kind of fear that came from realizing you were standing at the center of a career-ending disaster. "What exactly did you do to that woman?" Torres swallowed his donut and shrugged with the indifference of someone who had made dozens of similar arrests without consequences or second thoughts. Standard non-compliance arrest, nothing out of the ordinary. She was refusing to leave the aircraft, being belligerent with the crew, so we removed her according to protocol. "Did you use force?" Kowalski asked, though he already knew the answer from the sick feeling growing in his stomach as he began to piece together the implications of what had happened. "She was resisting," Torres said defensively, his tone suggesting that he was beginning to sense that something was wrong but couldn't quite understand what he had done differently from any other day on the job. "I used minimal necessary force to effect the arrest exactly like we're trained to do." At that exact moment, the front doors of the precinct burst open with enough force to rattle the windows, and Jonathan Pierce marched in flanked by two private security contractors who looked like they had been recruited from Navy SEAL teams and fed a steady diet of protein powder and righteous anger. Jonathan moved with the efficient grace of someone who had learned to navigate the world on a prosthetic leg, but refused to let that limitation slow him down or diminish his presence in any room he entered. He was wearing a suit that cost more than most police officers made in 6 months, carrying a briefcase that contained legal documents capable of destroying careers and bankrupting institutions, and his expression suggested that he was prepared to use every resource at his disposal to protect someone he cared about from people who had made the catastrophic mistake of underestimating her importance. "I am here for my client," Jonathan announced in a voice that cut through the normal sounds of precinct business, like a sword through silk, commanding immediate attention from everyone within earshot. "And if she has been harmed in any way, shape, or form, every single person involved in her arrest is going to experience legal consequences that will follow them for the rest of their lives." "Who is your client?" Sergeant Kowalski asked, though he already knew the answer and was desperately hoping that somehow there had been a misunderstanding that could be resolved without destroying his career and his pension. "Diana Crawford," Jonathan snarled, slamming a court order onto the desk with enough force to make coffee cups jump and papers scatter. "The woman your officers assaulted for the crime of sitting in an airplane seat that she paid for legally." Jonathan leaned across the desk, bringing his face close enough to Kowalski's that the sergeant could smell the expensive cologne and see the cold fury in eyes that had seen combat and weren't impressed by institutional authority or badge-wearing bullies. "I want her released immediately. I want medical attention for her injuries, and I want the names and badge numbers of everyone involved in this arrest so that my legal team can begin preparing the civil rights lawsuits that are going to cost this city more money than you can imagine." Kowalski scrambled for his keys with hands that were shaking so badly he dropped them twice before managing to get a grip that would allow him to function, running toward the holding cells with the desperate urgency of someone trying to contain a disaster that had already spiraled beyond any hope of control. He threw open the door to Diana's cell to find her sitting on the metal bench with perfect posture, her expression completely unreadable, looking like someone who was waiting patiently for a business meeting to begin, rather than someone who had been illegally imprisoned and physically assaulted by law enforcement officers. "Ms. Crawford," Kowalski stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager asking someone to prom. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding here. We had no idea who you were, and if we had known, you didn't know I was powerful." Diana finished for him, standing slowly and wincing as her injured shoulder protested the movement. "If I were a teacher or a nurse or a janitor, would this have been a mistake, Sergeant Kowalski? Or would it have been standard operating procedure?" Kowalski had no answer for that question because they both knew that the only reason he was apologizing was because she had turned out to be someone who could fight back, not because what his officers had done was wrong in any moral or ethical sense. Jonathan appeared in the doorway, and his expression immediately softened when he saw Diana, though his eyes hardened again when he noticed her injured shoulder and the way she was holding herself to minimize pain from bruises that were already forming from her rough treatment. "Diana, are you hurt?" Jonathan asked, his voice carrying the concern of someone who had been worried sick since receiving her emergency signal and racing across the city to reach her. "Get me my phone, Jonathan," Diana said calmly, walking past Sergeant Kowalski without acknowledging his presence or his stammered apologies. "And get me out of here. We have work to do." As they walked through the precinct toward the exit, Officer Torres stood pressed against the wall, looking small and frightened, finally beginning to understand that he had made a mistake that was going to have consequences far beyond anything he had experienced in his law enforcement career. Diana paused in front of him, not to gloat or threaten, but to deliver a simple statement of fact that would haunt him for years to come. "You damaged my shoulder, Officer Torres," she said quietly, her voice carrying no anger but absolute certainty about what was going to happen next. "Now I'm going to damage your career, your reputation, and your pension fund. The only difference is that what I'm about to do to you is completely legal." Diana walked out into the blinding afternoon sun, feeling like someone emerging from an underground cave after days of darkness, the natural light harsh against her eyes, but infinitely preferable to the fluorescent hell of institutional confinement. A black SUV was waiting at the curb, its engine running and its tinted windows reflecting the chaos of police cars and news vans that were already beginning to gather as word of the incident spread through social media and into mainstream news coverage. "Where to?" Jonathan asked as they climbed into the back seat, the leather interior a stark contrast to the metal bench she had been sitting on for the past 4 hours, though the luxury felt hollow when her shoulder was still throbbing with every heartbeat. Hospital. First, Jonathan continued, already pulling out his phone to call his medical contacts. "We need to document your injuries properly for the lawsuits that are going to bankrupt everyone involved in this disaster." "No," Diana said firmly, taking the tablet that Jonathan handed her and logging into her secure network with the kind of focus that suggested she had already moved past the trauma of arrest and into the strategic thinking that had made her one of the most successful business leaders of her generation. "Take me to the data center in New Jersey, the Crawford hub that handles all of Horizon's operational systems." Jonathan looked confused, clearly expecting her to prioritize medical attention and legal action rather than business operations. But he had learned over the years of their friendship to trust Diana's strategic instincts, even when he couldn't immediately see where she was heading. "Horizon Airways," Jonathan asked. "Why would you want to go there? Shouldn't we be focusing on the criminal charges and the civil rights violations?" Diana pulled up a specific contract on her tablet, Agreement 88 Alpha, the $4 billion infrastructure deal that kept Horizon Airways operational and competitive in an industry where a single day of system failures could destroy decades of brand building and customer loyalty. She scrolled to the termination clause with the kind of satisfaction that came from years of careful legal planning finally paying off in ways that her opponents never could have anticipated. Because Diana set her finger hovering over the execute command that would change everything. "I'm about to clip their wings in a way that money can't fix and lawyers can't undo." The Crawford Logistics Data Center in Jersey City was a fortress of glass, steel, and concrete that housed the digital nervous system of half the Fortune 500, a windowless monolith that hummed with the constant energy of servers processing billions of transactions and logistics calculations every second of every day. Diana arrived at 4:30 p.m., still wearing the same hoodie and leggings she had been arrested in, her hair still messy from the rough treatment by airport security, but radiating the kind of focused energy that made everyone in the building understand that something significant was about to happen. The main operations center fell silent when Diana entered, 20 analysts and engineers turning from their wall-mounted monitors to stare at their CEO taking in the bruises on her wrists from the handcuffs and the way she was favoring her injured shoulder, understanding without words that someone was about to pay a price for the injuries they were witnessing. "Status report on the Horizon Airways integration," Diana said, without preamble, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone who had no time for small talk or emotional processing, just business decisions that needed to be made with precision and speed. Timothy Walsh, her chief technology officer, and one of the few people in the building who had known Diana since the early days when Crawford Logistics operated out of a converted warehouse with second-hand computers and a staff of 12, stood up from his workstation with the kind of military bearing he had learned during his years in Army intelligence before Diana recruited him to the private sector. "We're at 98% integration," Tim reported, his voice carrying both professional competence and personal concern for his friend and CEO. "The migration was completed last week, and Horizon's legacy systems have been completely decommissioned according to schedule. They're running entirely on our infrastructure now, everything from crew scheduling to fuel optimization to passenger booking systems." Diana nodded, processing the information with the kind of strategic thinking that had built Crawford Logistics from a small startup into a company that controlled critical infrastructure for major corporations around the world. The timing was perfect in a way that suggested the universe occasionally aligned to provide justice when the legal system failed to do so. "Is the termination protocol active?" Diana asked, walking to the main control terminal where she could see a real-time map of the world dotted with thousands of small blue icons representing Horizon Airways flights currently in the air, each one dependent on Crawford's systems to maintain schedules, safety protocols, and operational efficiency. Tim hesitated for just a moment, understanding the implications of what she was asking and the magnitude of chaos that would result from activating the nuclear option that was built into every major contract as a last resort against clients who violated the ethical standards that Diana insisted on maintaining. "Clause 14B is ready for implementation," Tim confirmed. "But Diana, if we execute that protocol, Horizon Airways goes completely dark. We're talking about total operational paralysis. They won't be able to process a single passenger schedule, a crew, or even track their aircraft positions." Diana looked at the wall of monitors showing the global scope of Horizon's operations, billions of dollars in aircraft and infrastructure that would be rendered useless without the technological backbone that Crawford Logistics provided. And she thought about the handcuffs biting into her wrists and the way Officer Torres had twisted her arm, and the casual cruelty in Brandon Whitmore's voice as he kicked her belongings across the aircraft floor. "They assaulted me for sitting in a seat I paid for." Diana said, her voice carrying the weight of not just personal injury, but institutional racism that went far beyond one incident on one aircraft. "They dragged me off that plane because they thought I was nobody, because they thought I was powerless, because they thought there would be no consequences for treating me like trash." She pulled out her phone and called Preston Cole, the legal counsel who had been handling Crawford Logistics contract negotiations for over a decade, and understood better than anyone how to weaponize corporate law in service of justice when the conventional legal system moved too slowly to provide meaningful accountability. Preston, Diana said when he answered on the first ring, "I need you to send formal notice of contract breach to Horizon Airways General Counsel immediately. Cite gross violation of ethical conduct standards, assault of the vendor's CEO, and irreparable damage to Crawford Logistics' reputation through association with their discriminatory practices." "Consider it done," Preston replied, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting years for the opportunity to use the nuclear clauses that Diana insisted on including in every major contract. "They're going to panic when they realize what you can do to them, but by then it will be too late to prevent the consequences." Diana looked at Tim, her oldest friend in the business, and the person who understood better than anyone the principles that had driven her to build something greater than just another technology company. Something that stood for dignity and equality, and the radical idea that power should be used to protect people rather than exploit them. "Tim," Diana said quietly, "shut it down." Tim hesitated for only a heartbeat, his fingers hovering over the keyboard that would execute commands capable of bringing down one of the largest airlines in the world. But his loyalty to Diana Crawford went deeper than professional obligation or corporate hierarchy. It went back to the day she had paid for his daughter's experimental leukemia treatment out of her own pocket when his insurance company refused coverage, saving a child's life and proving that she was the kind of leader worth following into any battle. Initiating protocol. Icarus. Tim announced to the operations center, his voice carrying across the room full of analysts and engineers who understood they were about to witness something unprecedented in the history of corporate warfare. He pulled up the master control interface that governed Crawford's relationship with every major client, scrolling to the Horizon Airways account that represented $4 billion in annual revenue and the technological foundation that kept the airline competitive in a rapidly evolving industry. Authorization code required the system prompted, and Tim looked to Diana for confirmation that they were really going to take this irrevocable step that would destroy Horizon Airways' ability to function as a business while simultaneously costing Crawford Logistics one of its most lucrative contracts. Diana leaned over the keyboard, her injured shoulder protesting the movement, but her resolve absolutely unwavering as she typed the authorization phrase she had chosen years earlier when these nuclear protocols were first established. "Justice served cold. Execute," Diana said clearly, and Tim pressed the enter key with the kind of finality that changes the world in ways that cannot be undone or apologized away. On the massive wall of monitors that dominated the operations center, the thousands of blue icons representing Horizon Airways' global network didn't just flicker or dim. They vanished, completely disappearing from the digital map, as if the airline had simply ceased to exist in the technological realm that governed modern commercial aviation. Flight tracking systems went dark. Crew scheduling databases became inaccessible. Passenger reservation systems displayed error messages, and fuel optimization algorithms stopped calculating the routes that kept Horizon's aircraft flying efficiently and profitably. In the space of 30 seconds, Crawford Logistics had effectively erased Horizon Airways from the digital infrastructure that made modern airline operations possible, leaving the company's executives staring at blank screens and error messages, while their aircraft continued flying on autopilot toward destinations they could no longer track or coordinate from their command centers. The silence in the operations center was broken by the sound of phones beginning to ring throughout the building as Crawford's other clients, monitoring the news coverage of Diana's arrest and understanding the implications for their own relationships with the company, began calling to confirm that their contracts remained secure and their operations would not be affected by whatever corporate warfare was about to unfold. Diana walked to the windows overlooking the Hudson River, her reflection ghostly in the darkened glass, thinking about the phone calls that were probably already flooding Horizon Airways' headquarters as airports around the world began reporting system failures and operational shutdowns that would ground every aircraft in their fleet within hours. She thought about her grandmother who had cleaned office buildings at night to pay for Diana's school clothes and had taught her that dignity was something that could never be taken away, only surrendered, and that true power came not from the ability to destroy your enemies, but from the wisdom to know when destruction was the only language they would understand. Meanwhile, halfway across the country in Dallas, Texas, Raymond Reed sat in his corner office at Horizon Airways headquarters, pouring himself the first of what would be many glasses of scotch as the reports began streaming in from airports around the world. Reed had built his career on customer service and operational excellence, rising from baggage handler to CEO through decades of hard work and genuine care for both passengers and employees. But he was surrounded by advisors and executives who had convinced him that cost-cutting and aggressive passenger management were necessary to compete in the modern airline industry. Reed's assistant, Karen Holloway, burst through his office door without knocking, her usually perfect composure completely shattered as she clutched a tablet displaying system alerts and error messages that painted a picture of complete operational collapse. "Ray, the boards!" Karen screamed, her voice cracking with panic. "Look at the screens. Everything is down. Everything is offline. We can't access any of our core systems." Reed frowned and turned to his computer, expecting to see the familiar dashboard of operational metrics that governed every aspect of Horizon's global operations, but instead found a black screen with a single line of white text blinking ominously in the center. "Access denied. Contract terminated under Clause 14B. Contact vendor Crawford Logistics for details." "What the hell is this?" Reed shouted, slamming his mouse against the desk hard enough to crack the plastic casing. "Reboot everything. Restart the servers. Call IT support. Fix this immediately. We can't fix it." "Ray!" Karen cried, tears of panic streaming down her face as the magnitude of the disaster became clear. "It's not a technical failure, it's a complete lockout. JFK is reporting total system failure." Heathrow can't process passengers. Tokyo has grounded our entire fleet. We can't check people in, we can't verify baggage. We can't even access pilot rosters to know who's supposed to be flying what aircraft. The color drained from Reed's face as he began to understand that this wasn't a technical glitch or a cyber attack that could be resolved with IT support and system reboots, but a deliberate act of corporate warfare executed by someone with the power to destroy Horizon Airways with a few keystrokes. Call Diana Crawford. Reed whispered, his voice barely audible as the reality of his situation began to sink in. Get her on the phone immediately. Offer her whatever she wants. Double the contract value. Triple it if necessary. We tried. Karen sobbed, her professional composure completely gone as she faced the prospect of watching the company she had worked for destroy itself in real time. Her office says she's unavailable for comment, and all communication should go through her legal counsel. Who's her lawyer? Reed asked, though he already suspected the answer would be someone with the kind of reputation that could turn a simple contract dispute into a corporate execution. Preston Cole, Karen whispered, and Reed's face went completely white as he recognized the name of one of the most feared litigators in corporate America, someone whose involvement meant that this situation had moved far beyond business negotiations into the realm of legal warfare, with consequences that could destroy careers and bankrupt companies. Reed's phone began ringing with the insistent tone that meant emergency calls from federal aviation authorities. His cell phone started buzzing with messages from board members demanding explanations he couldn't provide. And Karen's phone displayed missed calls from airport operations managers around the world who were dealing with thousands of stranded passengers and aircraft that couldn't be moved or tracked through normal channels. 3 hours after the shutdown began, Reed found himself in the humiliating position of calling Diana Crawford's office every 15 minutes like a desperate salesman trying to reach a client who had decided to take their business elsewhere. Each unanswered call increasing his panic and making it clear that Crawford Logistics held all the power in whatever negotiation might eventually take place. The Federal Aviation Authority had grounded Horizon's entire fleet after determining that the airline could no longer maintain the safety and tracking protocols required for commercial aviation, stranding over 50,000 passengers in airports around the world and creating a public relations disaster that was being broadcast live on every major news network as the story of Diana's arrest continued to viral across social media platforms. When Preston Cole finally returned Reed's call at 7:30 p.m., his voice carried the calm satisfaction of someone who held all the cards in a high-stakes poker game and was prepared to play them with surgical precision to achieve maximum damage to opponents who had underestimated their adversary. Mr. Reed, Preston said with false politeness that barely concealed his contempt for the man whose airline had assaulted his client. I understand you've been trying to reach Miss Crawford regarding some technical difficulties you're experiencing with your operational systems. Preston, this is a disaster, Reed pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation as he watched his company's stock price collapse in real time on the television mounted in his office. Whatever Diana wants, whatever it takes to resolve this situation, we're prepared to negotiate in good faith. Good faith. Preston laughed, a sound like broken glass scraping against concrete. You're talking about good faith after your employees physically assaulted my client for the crime of sitting in a seat she paid for. After your captain called airport security to have her dragged off your aircraft in handcuffs. Reed tried to interrupt with explanations and excuses, but Preston continued speaking with the relentless precision of someone reading charges at a criminal trial. After your flight crew lied to police officers about her behavior leading to her illegal arrest and imprisonment. After she was injured by officers who used excessive force based on false information provided by your employees. I didn't know, Reed whispered, though they both understood that ignorance was not a defense when your company had created a culture that enabled and encouraged the kind of discrimination Diana had experienced. You didn't know because you didn't want to know, Preston replied coldly. You created a culture where passengers could be judged by their appearance rather than their tickets, where flight crews could lie about passenger behavior to justify calling security, where discrimination was not just tolerated but institutionalized as standard operating procedure. Reed tried to shift the conversation toward practical solutions and financial settlements, offering to double Crawford's contract value, provide additional compensation for Diana's injuries and suffering, and implement comprehensive reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. But Preston cut him off before he could finish outlining his proposals. "Mr. Reed, you're not in a position to negotiate," Preston said with the cold finality of someone delivering a death sentence. "You're in a position to surrender, and the terms of that surrender will be dictated by Ms. Crawford when she decides you've suffered enough consequences to understand the magnitude of your failures." Preston ended the call, leaving Reed staring at his phone and listening to the dial tone while Karen fielded angry calls from board members who were demanding his immediate resignation and threatening to sue him personally for the negligent management that had led to this corporate catastrophe. On television screens around the world, news anchors were reporting the story with the kind of breathless excitement that came from covering a David and Goliath battle where technology had replaced slingshots and corporate contracts had become weapons of mass destruction, capable of bringing down billion-dollar companies in a matter of hours. Meanwhile, in the Crawford Logistics Command Center, Diana sat at the head of a conference table surrounded by her senior staff, monitoring the global impact of their decision through news feeds, stock market reports, and intelligence gathered from contacts throughout the airline industry who were watching Horizon's collapse with a mixture of horror and fascination. Timothy Walsh pulled up a real-time analysis of Horizon's financial position on the main screen, showing a company that had lost over 60% of its market value in less than 6 hours and was facing potential bankruptcy within weeks if service couldn't be restored quickly enough to prevent permanent damage to customer confidence and regulatory standing. "They're bleeding out financially." Tim reported, his voice carrying no satisfaction, despite the tactical success of their operation. "The board is meeting an emergency session, and there are reports that Reed might be forced to resign before morning if he can't find a way to restore service." Diana studied the data with the analytical detachment she brought to all business decisions, weighing the satisfaction of watching her attackers face consequences against her grandmother's teachings about the difference between justice and vengeance, between using power to protect people and using it simply to inflict pain on enemies who had earned your hatred. "How many passengers are stranded?" Diana asked, focusing on the human cost of their corporate warfare rather than the financial damage to Horizon's shareholders and executives. "Approximately 52,000 people are stuck in airports worldwide," Tim replied, pulling up passenger manifests and flight schedules that painted a picture of families separated from loved ones. Business travelers, missing critical meetings and vacation plans, destroyed by the ripple effects of Diana's decision to punish discrimination with corporate warfare. Diana felt a moment of doubt, wondering whether she was using a sledgehammer to kill a fly, whether there might have been ways to achieve justice without causing suffering for innocent people who had nothing to do with her treatment on Flight 247. But then she touched her injured shoulder and remembered the casual cruelty in Brandon Whitmore's voice as he kicked her belongings across the cabin floor. Reed called again. Preston reported via speakerphone from his office in Manhattan. "He's offering triple compensation, full policy reforms, congressional testimony about discrimination in aviation. He'll do anything to get the systems restored." Diana looked around the table at the faces of people who had followed her from Crawford Logistics' earliest days as a scrappy startup through its evolution into a technology powerhouse that could bring down Fortune 500 companies with a few lines of computer code, and she saw in their eyes the same question she was asking herself. How long do you make someone suffer before offering them a chance at redemption? While Reed continued his desperate attempts to reach Diana through intermediaries and back channels, the real power dynamics were shifting in ways that neither Horizon Airways nor the broader airline industry had anticipated, as federal regulators and congressional leaders began using the Crawford-Horizon situation as a catalyst for comprehensive reform of passenger rights and discrimination enforcement across the entire commercial aviation sector. Diana gave her first and only television interview at 9 p.m. that evening, sitting in her office with the New York skyline glittering behind her through floor-to-ceiling windows, wearing a crisp white blazer that made her look every inch the powerful executive she had always been, though her arm remained in the medical sling that served as a visual reminder of the violence she had experienced. Anderson Cooper leaned forward across the polished conference table that served as an interview set, his expression carrying the kind of serious concern that suggested he understood the historical significance of what they were discussing, not just as a business story, but as a moment that could define how discrimination was addressed in corporate America. Mrs. Crawford, some critics are saying that shutting down an entire airline stranding thousands of innocent passengers is a disproportionate response to what happened to you on Flight 247, Cooper said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who wanted to ask tough questions without appearing to minimize the discrimination she had experienced. Diana looked directly into the camera with the kind of calm authority that had made her one of the most respected voices in the technology industry, speaking not just to Cooper but to the millions of viewers who were watching this interview and deciding whether they saw her as a victim seeking justice or a powerful executive abusing her position to settle personal scores. "Anderson, this isn't about me," Diana said, her voice carrying the kind of conviction that made it impossible to doubt her sincerity. "This is about every person who has been judged by their appearance rather than their character. Every passenger who has been removed from flights they paid for because someone decided they didn't belong in premium seating, every traveler who has been treated as a criminal for existing while black in spaces that some people think should be reserved for certain kinds of customers." She gestured toward her injured shoulder, the sling serving as physical evidence of how quickly discrimination could escalate into violence when institutions failed to protect the dignity of all their customers. "What happened to me happens to ordinary people every single day, but most of them don't have the power to fight back in ways that force accountability." Diana continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke about the broader principles that had driven her decision to wage corporate warfare against systemic injustice. They get removed from flights, arrested, humiliated, and then forgotten because airlines know that individual passengers don't have the resources to challenge institutional discrimination. Cooper nodded, clearly moved by her explanation, but still pressing on the practical implications of her decision to shut down Horizon's operations. "But what about the passengers who are stranded tonight because of your decision? Families separated from loved ones, business travelers, missing critical meetings, people whose lives are being disrupted by this corporate battle." Diana's expression softened slightly, showing the human cost she was weighing against the necessity of sending a message that would resonate throughout an industry that had become comfortable with discrimination as long as it was subtle enough to avoid viral videos and federal investigations. "I regret that innocent people are being inconvenienced," Diana said, carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood that every syllable would be analyzed and quoted for years to come. "But lasting change requires consequences that are impossible to ignore, and sometimes the only way to protect future passengers from discrimination is to make it clear that airlines will face real costs for enabling and defending racist behavior by their employees." The interview continued for another 20 minutes, with Diana explaining the specific contract clauses that had enabled her response, the legal framework that protected her actions, and her vision for an airline industry where passenger dignity was protected by more than just public relations statements and diversity training seminars that had no real enforcement mechanisms. By the time the interview aired, other passengers from Flight 247 had begun coming forward with their own accounts of the incident, providing additional evidence that supported Diana's version of events and contradicted the airline's initial narrative about a disruptive passenger who had posed a security threat to other travelers. Maya Rodriguez and Jordan Kim, the young couple who had filmed the entire incident, were invited onto multiple news programs to share their footage and their perspectives as witnesses to discrimination and violence that had shocked them despite years of creating content about social justice and racial inequality. We've filmed protests and rallies and community organizing events, Maya explained to a CNN anchor, her voice carrying the kind of moral clarity that came from witnessing injustice firsthand and refusing to look away. But seeing someone treated like that right in front of us just for sitting in a seat she paid for, it was like watching everything we've been fighting against play out in real time. Jordan nodded, adding context about the casual nature of the discrimination they had witnessed and the way other passengers had either ignored the situation or actively participated in the humiliation of someone who posed no threat to anyone. The scariest part wasn't the arrest, Jordan said. It was how normal it seemed to everyone involved, like they had done this dozens of times before and expected to do it dozens more times in the future, because they thought there would never be consequences for treating people like that. Meanwhile, across the country, in her modest apartment in suburban Chicago, Ashley Chen sat in her living room watching the news coverage with her 12-year-old daughter Lily, both of them staring at the television screen as news anchors analyzed the viral video that showed Ashley's face clearly as she lied to police officers about Diana's behavior and contributed to the escalation that led to violence. Lily looked at her mother with the kind of disappointed confusion that cut deeper than any professional consequence or public humiliation. "Mom, why did you say those things about that lady?" Lily asked, her voice carrying the innocent directness of someone who had been taught to tell the truth and treat people with kindness, but was now confronting evidence that her mother had failed to live up to those basic standards of human decency. Ashley felt her world cracking apart as she tried to find words to explain behavior that she was only now beginning to understand was indefensible, realizing that her daughter was learning lessons about integrity and character by watching her mother's failures broadcast to the entire world. At midnight, exactly 24 hours after Diana's arrest, she made the decision that would determine whether Horizon Airways survived as a company or joined the list of corporations that had been destroyed by their own failures to treat all customers with basic dignity and respect. She called Reed directly, bypassing lawyers and intermediaries, speaking to him as one CEO to another in a conversation that would determine the fate of thousands of employees and millions of passengers who depended on Horizon's services for business and personal travel. "Mr. Reed," Diana said when he answered on the first ring, her voice carrying no anger or triumph, just the professional courtesy of someone prepared to negotiate terms for ending a corporate war that had already demonstrated her power to destroy opponents who underestimated her capabilities. "Diana, thank God." Reed gasped, his voice hoarse from hours of crisis management and board meetings that had left him fighting for his professional survival. "I've been trying to reach you all day. Whatever you want, whatever it takes to resolve this situation, we are prepared to meet your terms." Diana looked out her office windows at the city lights stretching to the horizon, thinking about the power she wielded and the responsibility that came with using it wisely rather than vindictively. "I want systemic changes, not symbolic gestures," Diana said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had built a company from nothing and understood the difference between cosmetic reforms and structural transformation. "I want Captain Hayes terminated immediately, stripped of his pension, and reported to the FAA for violations of federal passenger protection protocols." "Done," Reed replied without hesitation, finally understanding that his survival depended on demonstrating real accountability rather than trying to minimize the situation or protect employees who had created legal and financial disasters for his company. "I want Ashley Chen removed from customer-facing positions permanently, though I'm prepared to discuss retraining opportunities if she demonstrates genuine commitment to understanding and correcting her discriminatory behavior." "Absolutely." Reed agreed, making notes on legal pads as Diana outlined terms that would reshape Horizon's corporate culture and operational procedures in ways that would prevent future incidents while providing pathways for redemption for employees who were willing to acknowledge their failures and commit to meaningful change. I want Officer Torres banned from Horizon property permanently, and I want your airline to file formal complaints with airport authorities demanding his removal from aviation security details. Consider it done. Reed said, his voice gaining strength as he realized that Diana was offering him a path to survival rather than simply dictating terms for corporate execution. Diana continued outlining her demands. Comprehensive bias training for all customer-facing employees, independent oversight of discrimination, complaints, financial penalties for verified incidents of passenger mistreatment, and public reporting of all discrimination allegations and their resolution, creating transparency that would make it impossible for airlines to quietly sweep problems under the rug. "And I want you to understand," Diana said as their conversation neared its conclusion, "that this contract modification is not just about money or policies. It's about proving that your company has learned something from this experience and won't repeat the same mistakes with other passengers who don't have the power to fight back." Reed agreed to every term without negotiation, understanding that his company's survival depended on demonstrating genuine transformation rather than token gestures designed to appease critics while maintaining the underlying culture that had enabled discrimination and violence against paying customers. At 12:47 a.m., Diana gave the command to restore Horizon's systems watching on her office monitors as thousands of blue icons reappeared on the global flight tracking display's aircraft positions, updating passenger reservations becoming accessible again, and crew schedules synchronizing with airports around the world that had been struggling to maintain operations without technological support. The restoration was gradual and controlled, allowing Horizon's operations teams to restart their systems safely while demonstrating Crawford Logistics' ability to provide or withdraw critical services based on their clients' adherence to ethical standards that protected the dignity of all passengers, regardless of their appearance or economic status. Within hours, Reed would face congressional hearings about discrimination in aviation federal investigations into Horizon's passenger treatment policies and shareholder lawsuits demanding accountability for the management failures that had nearly bankrupted the company. But he would also have the opportunity to rebuild Horizon as an industry leader in passenger rights and inclusive service. Diana remained in her office through the dawn, watching news coverage of passengers finally boarding flights, families reuniting in airports around the world, and business travelers reaching their destinations after a night of uncertainty and delay that had taught the entire airline industry that discrimination would face swift and severe consequences from companies with the power to enforce accountability through economic pressure. 2 weeks after what media outlets had dubbed the Crawford crisis, Diana sat in the same conference room where she had given her television interview, preparing for a face-to-face meeting with the people whose actions had triggered a corporate war that reshaped the airline industry and established new standards for passenger dignity and civil rights enforcement in commercial aviation. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, casting long shadows across the polished conference table where Diana's legal team had arranged documents that would formalize the new relationship between Crawford Logistics and Horizon Airways, a partnership built on accountability rather than the mutual convenience that had characterized most corporate contracts in the aviation industry. Raymond Reed entered the conference room looking like a man who had aged 5 years. In 2 weeks, his usually perfect appearance showing the strain of congressional hearings, federal investigations, and board meetings that had threatened his career, while forcing him to confront the institutional failures that had enabled discrimination and violence against paying customers. Behind Reed came his reduced legal team, no longer the army of corporate attorneys who had initially tried to minimize Horizon's liability, but a small group of specialists in civil rights law and corporate transformation who understood that their client's survival depended on genuine reform rather than legal maneuvering designed to avoid accountability. Diana remained seated as they entered, not out of rudeness, but as a subtle reminder of the power dynamics that now governed their relationship. her arm still in the medical sling that served as physical evidence of the violence that had necessitated this complete restructuring of how airlines treated passengers who didn't fit conventional expectations about who belonged in premium seating. "Mister," Reed Diana said as he took his seat across from her, her voice carrying none of the anger or vindictiveness that might have been expected from someone who had been physically assaulted and illegally arrested, but instead the professional courtesy of someone prepared to rebuild a business relationship on a foundation of mutual respect and clearly defined expectations. "I want to start by acknowledging what my company did wrong," Reed said, his voice carrying the kind of genuine remorse that suggested he had spent the past 2 weeks truly understanding the magnitude of his airline's failures, rather than simply calculating damage control strategies to protect his reputation and his position. "We failed you as a passenger. We failed our other customers who witnessed discrimination and violence. And we failed our employees by creating a culture where your mistreatment was seen as normal and acceptable behavior." Diana nodded, appreciating the directness of his approach while remaining focused on the structural changes that would prevent similar incidents rather than personal apologies that couldn't undo the harm that had been done or guarantee that other passengers wouldn't face similar treatment in the future. "Apologies are meaningful only if they're accompanied by actions," Diana replied, gesturing toward the contract modifications that would govern their ongoing relationship and establish Horizon Airways as either a model for passenger rights enforcement or a cautionary tale about the consequences of institutional discrimination. Reed outlined the comprehensive changes his airline had implemented during the crisis. Captain Hayes had been terminated and reported to federal aviation authorities for violations of passenger protection protocols. Ashley Chen had been removed from customer service positions, pending completion of intensive retraining programs focused on unconscious bias and cultural sensitivity, and new policies had been established requiring independent review of all passenger complaints involving allegations of discriminatory treatment. But policy changes are only as effective as the people who implement them. Reed continued, his voice gaining strength as he described his vision for transforming Horizon Airways from a company that had enabled discrimination into an industry leader in passenger dignity and inclusive service. "We've partnered with the NAACP and other civil rights organizations to develop training programs that go beyond legal compliance to address the underlying attitudes and assumptions that led to your mistreatment. And we've established an independent oversight board with the authority to investigate complaints and impose penalties for verified incidents of discrimination." Diana listened carefully, evaluating Reed's proposals not just as business arrangements, but as evidence of whether Horizon Airways had learned from its failures or was simply offering cosmetic changes designed to avoid future public relations disasters, while maintaining the fundamental culture that had enabled violence against passengers who challenged employee assumptions about who belonged in premium seating. "I'm prepared to modify our contract," Diana said finally, "but not to return to the previous relationship. Crawford Logistics will continue providing technological services to Horizon Airways, but at rates that reflect the additional risk we're assuming by working with a company that has demonstrated a willingness to assault and arrest passengers for exercising their legal rights." She outlined terms that tripled the cost of Crawford's services while establishing performance standards and accountability mechanisms that would make it financially devastating for Horizon to repeat the mistakes that had nearly destroyed their business, creating economic incentives for treating all passengers with dignity, regardless of their appearance or economic status. Reed accepted every term without negotiation, understanding that his company's survival depended on proving through actions rather than promises that they had learned from their failures and would not repeat the institutional discrimination that had led to Diana's arrest and the corporate crisis that followed. An hour after Reed and his legal team departed, Diana faced a more complex and emotionally challenging meeting with the individuals whose personal actions had triggered the events that reshaped her company's relationship with the airline industry and established new precedents for using corporate power to enforce civil rights protections in commercial aviation. Brandon Whitmore entered the conference room alone, his previous arrogance replaced by the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who had lost everything and was still processing the magnitude of his fall from privilege and power to financial ruin and social disgrace. His expensive suits replaced by off-the-rack clothing that suggested his dramatic change in economic circumstances. Miss Crawford, Brandon said quietly, remaining standing until Diana gestured for him to sit, his voice carrying none of the entitled condescension that had characterized his behavior on Flight 247, replaced by the careful humility of someone who had learned too late that actions have consequences and words have power to destroy lives and careers. I know that apologizing can't undo what I did to you. Brandon continued, his voice breaking slightly as he struggled to find words adequate to address behavior that he was only now beginning to understand as fundamentally indefensible. I know that my actions contributed to your assault and arrest, and I know that you have every right to hate me for the rest of your life. Diana studied his face, looking for evidence of genuine transformation, rather than calculated remorse designed to elicit sympathy or mercy from someone who held the power to complete his destruction or offer him a path toward redemption through meaningful service to communities he had helped to marginalize. I don't hate you, Mr. Whitmore, Diana said slowly, her voice carrying the kind of measured consideration that suggested she had thought carefully about how to respond to someone whose privilege and prejudice had caused real harm, but who now seemed to understand the gravity of his failures. I hate what you represent. The casual cruelty that comes from never having to face consequences for treating other people as less than human. But hating you personally would be a waste of emotional energy that I prefer to invest in preventing other people from experiencing what I experienced. Brandon nodded, accepting her assessment without defensiveness or excuses, his transformation evident in his willingness to hear criticism without arguing or minimizing his role in events that had taught him brutal lessons about accountability and the difference between inherited privilege and earned respect. I've lost everything, Brandon said, simply not as a plea for sympathy, but as a statement of fact about consequences that he acknowledged were proportionate to his actions. My investors pulled their capital. My clients terminated their relationships. My family has disowned me. I'm facing bankruptcy and professional exile. Diana waited for him to continue, understanding that this conversation was about more than personal accountability, but about the possibility of redemption through service and the question of whether someone who had caused harm could be trusted to work toward healing, rather than simply seeking to restore his own position and comfort. I want to ask for a chance to make amends, Brandon said, his voice carrying the tentative hope of someone who understood that forgiveness was not guaranteed, but still believed in the possibility of earning redemption through dedicated service to communities he had harmed. Not to restore my previous life, but to build something better from the ruins of my failures. Diana considered his request with the same analytical approach she brought to business decisions, weighing the potential benefits of offering someone a path to redemption against the risks of trusting someone whose previous actions had demonstrated callous indifference to other people's dignity and humanity. Crawford Logistics is establishing a financial literacy foundation for underserved communities, Diana said finally. Young people who need to understand money management, investment strategies, and economic empowerment as tools for building generational wealth rather than perpetuating cycles of poverty. She looked directly into Brandon's eyes, seeing not the arrogant hedge fund manager who had kicked her belongings across an airplane floor, but someone who might be capable of using his financial expertise to serve rather than exploit communities that had been excluded from economic opportunities. If you're genuinely committed to making amends, you can start by teaching financial literacy in community centers and high schools working without pay until you've demonstrated that your transformation is real rather than performative. Brandon accepted immediately, understanding that this opportunity represented not just a chance at redemption, but a test of whether he was capable of finding meaning and purpose in service rather than in accumulating wealth and social status at other people's expense. 30 minutes later, Ashley Chen entered the conference room accompanied by her 12-year-old daughter, Lily, both of them carrying themselves with the careful dignity of people who had spent weeks confronting hard truths about actions and their consequences, preparing for a conversation that would determine whether Ashley's career in the airline industry could continue in any form. Ms. Crawford Ashley said, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of facing someone she had wronged through lies and discriminatory treatment that had escalated a simple seating dispute into violence and illegal arrest. "I brought Lily because I want her to hear me take responsibility for what I did to you, and I want her to understand that adults must face consequences when they fail to treat other people with basic respect and dignity." Diana looked at Lily, seeing in her young face the same mixture of curiosity and moral clarity that had characterized her own daughter at that age, understanding that this conversation was about more than professional consequences, but about the values and principles that would shape the next generation's understanding of justice and accountability. "I lied about your behavior to police officers." Ashley continued, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent weeks understanding the full implications of actions she had taken without considering their potential consequences. "I escalated a situation that should have been resolved with courtesy and professionalism, and I contributed to your assault and arrest because I made assumptions based on your appearance rather than treating you as a valued customer who deserved respect." Lily looked up at her mother with a mixture of disappointment and love, clearly struggling to reconcile the person she had always known with the evidence of failures that had been broadcast to the entire world, learning difficult lessons about the complexity of human character and the importance of making choices based on principles rather than prejudices. "I've been participating in bias training and cultural sensitivity programs," Ashley said, addressing Diana directly while remaining aware that her daughter was listening to every word and learning lessons that would influence her own approach to treating people with dignity, regardless of their appearance or economic status. "I understand now that what I did to you was wrong, not just because it violated airline policies, but because it violated basic human decency and the values I thought I was teaching my daughter." Diana felt her anger softening as she watched the interaction between mother and daughter, recognizing the genuine transformation that could occur when people were forced to confront the gap between their professed values and their actual behavior. Understanding that lasting change required not just punishment, but education and the opportunity to rebuild relationships on foundations of mutual respect. Horizon Airways has offered me a position in their new passenger advocacy program. Ashley continued working to identify and address discriminatory practices before they escalate into situations like what happened to you. But I wanted to ask for your perspective on whether that represents genuine accountability or just another form of institutional protection for employees who have demonstrated poor judgment. Diana considered the question carefully, understanding that Ashley's future role could either contribute to meaningful reform or simply provide cover for an airline trying to appear progressive while maintaining the underlying culture that had enabled discrimination and violence against passengers who challenged employee assumptions about who belonged in premium seating. "Redemption requires more than good intentions," Diana said finally. "It requires sustained commitment to doing the hard work of confronting bias and building systems that protect people rather than institutions. If you're genuinely committed to that work, you could help prevent other passengers from experiencing what I experienced." As the personal meetings concluded and Diana prepared for the final phase of resolving the crisis that had reshaped the airline industry's approach to passenger rights and discrimination enforcement, she reflected on the complex balance between justice and mercy, between holding people accountable for their actions and offering them opportunities to contribute to solutions rather than simply facing punishment for problems they had helped to create. The new contract between Crawford Logistics and Horizon Airways was signed in a ceremony attended by federal aviation authorities. Civil rights leaders and media representatives who had followed the story from Diana's arrest through the corporate warfare that had nearly destroyed one of the largest airlines in the world to the negotiated resolution that established new standards for passenger dignity and corporate accountability. Reed signed the documents with the humility of someone who had learned that leadership required acknowledging failures rather than minimizing them, understanding that Horizon Airways' survival depended on proving through actions that they had transformed their corporate culture rather than simply implemented cosmetic changes designed to avoid future public relations disasters. This agreement represents more than a business contract, Reed said as he addressed the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had been forced to confront the gap between corporate rhetoric about customer service and the reality of how passengers were actually treated when they challenged employee assumptions about who belonged in premium seating. It represents our commitment to ensuring that every passenger, regardless of their appearance or economic background, is treated with the dignity and respect that should be fundamental to commercial aviation. And it establishes enforcement mechanisms that will make discrimination financially devastating for any airline that chooses to maintain cultures of prejudice and exclusion. Diana watched the ceremony with satisfaction tempered by awareness that signing documents was easier than changing hearts and minds, that lasting transformation would require sustained effort over years rather than dramatic gestures that generated positive media coverage while leaving underlying attitudes unchanged. But the agreement also established precedents that other airlines were already adopting, creating industry-wide pressure for passenger protection policies that went beyond legal compliance to address the cultural factors that enabled discrimination and violence against travelers who didn't fit conventional expectations about who belonged in premium seating or who deserved respectful treatment from airline employees. Federal legislation inspired by Diana's case was moving through Congress with bipartisan support, establishing passenger bills of rights that would make discrimination legally actionable and financially costly, while creating oversight mechanisms that would prevent airlines from quietly sweeping complaints under the rug rather than addressing the underlying problems that generated them. The Diana Crawford Foundation had been established with initial funding from the settlement with Horizon Airways, focusing on passenger advocacy bias, training for transportation, industry employees, and financial support for individuals who faced discrimination but lacked the resources to fight back against institutional prejudice that treated certain passengers as less deserving of dignity and respect. As Diana left the signing ceremony and returned to her office, she found a handwritten letter from a young woman named Janet Williams, a college student who had been removed from a flight 3 months earlier under circumstances similar to Diana's experience, but had been unable to afford legal representation or generate media attention sufficient to force accountability from the airline that had mistreated her. Mrs. Crawford. The letter read, "I wanted to thank you for proving that our dignity matters, and that there are consequences for people who think they can treat us like criminals for existing in spaces where they don't think we belong. Because of your courage in fighting back, I've been contacted by lawyers who want to help me seek justice for what happened to me, and the airline has agreed to settle my case and implement training programs that will protect other passengers from experiencing what we experienced." Diana smiled as she read the letter, understanding that the real victory was not the financial settlement or the policy changes, or even the personal accountability imposed on individuals who had caused harm, but the message sent to every passenger that their dignity was worth protecting, and that institutions would face real consequences for enabling or defending discriminatory treatment. 6 months after Flight 247, Diana boarded another Horizon Airways aircraft for a business trip to London, walking through the same terminal where she had been arrested and dragged away in handcuffs, noting the changes in staff training, passenger interaction protocols, and the general atmosphere of respect and professionalism that had replaced the casual indifference that had characterized her previous experience. The flight attendant who greeted her at the aircraft door was not Ashley Chen, who was completing her retraining program and working in passenger advocacy rather than direct customer service, but a young man whose nameplate read Marcus Johnson and whose demeanor suggested he had been trained to see every passenger as someone deserving of dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or economic status. "Welcome aboard, Ms." Crawford Marcus said with genuine warmth rather than the performative courtesy that often characterized premium service, his greeting carrying none of the judgment or condescension that had marked Diana's previous interactions with Horizon Airways employees. Diana took her seat in 2A, the same position she had occupied months earlier, when her simple desire to rest during a long flight had triggered events that reshaped an entire industry's approach to passenger rights and corporate accountability. And she felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that other travelers would be protected by the changes her courage had forced into existence. As the aircraft taxied toward takeoff, Diana looked out the window at the tarmac, where ground crew members worked with the kind of professional efficiency that had always characterized aviation, but now operated within a framework of accountability and oversight that made discrimination and mistreatment financially devastating for any airline that chose to maintain cultures of prejudice and exclusion rather than embracing the diversity that characterized modern commercial travel. The other passengers in first class represented the kind of economic and ethnic diversity that Diana had fought to protect business travelers and vacation passengers who had purchased premium seating based on their ability to pay rather than their conformity to someone else's assumptions about who belonged in spaces traditionally reserved for wealthy white customers who never faced challenges to their right to occupy the seats they had purchased legally. Sitting across the aisle was James Mitchell, a young black software engineer who was traveling to London for his first international business conference wearing a simple hoodie and jeans that marked him as exactly the kind of passenger who might have faced discrimination and harassment before the changes that Diana's experience had forced throughout the airline industry. During the meal service, Diana noticed James hesitating before ringing his call button, the subtle caution of someone who had learned to minimize his presence and avoid drawing attention from service workers who might interpret normal passenger requests as demanding or entitled behavior that justified hostile or dismissive treatment. "Excuse me," Diana said quietly, leaning across the aisle to speak with him directly. "I'm Diana Crawford, and I noticed you seemed concerned about calling for service. You have every right to ask for anything you need during this flight, and the crew is trained to respond with courtesy and professionalism to every passenger regardless of their appearance or age." James looked up with surprise and recognition, clearly understanding the significance of receiving encouragement from someone whose courage had established the passenger protection policies that were now standard throughout commercial aviation, creating an environment where his dignity would be protected rather than challenged, based on prejudiced assumptions about who belonged in premium seating. "I've read about your case," James said with the kind of respectful admiration usually reserved for historical figures whose sacrifices had created opportunities for future generations. "Thank you for fighting back and proving that our dignity matters even when it's expensive and difficult to defend." Diana smiled, understanding that her legacy was not the financial settlement or the policy changes or even the personal accountability imposed on individuals who had caused harm, but the confidence that young professionals like James could now travel with the knowledge that they would be treated with respect rather than suspicion when they occupied spaces they had earned through their achievements and purchased with their own money. When the flight attendant approached their section, Marcus Johnson demonstrated the kind of attentive, respectful service that had become standard at Horizon Airways since the implementation of new training programs and accountability mechanisms that made passenger satisfaction a genuine priority rather than empty corporate rhetoric designed to deflect criticism without addressing underlying problems. "Mr. Mitchell is there. Anything I can get you during the flight?" Marcus asked with genuine interest in ensuring passenger comfort rather than the performative courtesy that often characterized premium service, his question carrying none of the judgment or condescension that might have marked similar interactions before Diana's case had forced comprehensive reform throughout the industry. James requested a cup of coffee and a blanket for the long overnight flight. Simple requests that were fulfilled immediately and cheerfully, demonstrating the transformation that had occurred not just in policies and procedures, but in the fundamental culture of how airline employees viewed their relationships with passengers who deserved respect rather than suspicion regardless of their appearance or economic background. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude and the cabin lights dimmed for the overnight journey, Diana reflected on the journey that had begun with humiliation and assault, but had concluded with systematic changes that would protect countless future passengers from experiencing the discrimination and violence that she had endured, proving that individual courage could generate institutional transformation when supported by strategic thinking and sustained commitment to justice. The young man sleeping peacefully across the aisle represented not just personal validation for her decision to fight back against discrimination, but evidence that the principles she had defended, dignity, respect, equality, and the radical idea that everyone deserved to be treated as fully human regardless of their appearance, had been translated into practical policies and cultural changes that would outlast any individual case or news cycle. Through the airplane window, Diana could see the lights of cities passing below millions of people living their lives and pursuing their dreams in a world that was marginally more just because she had refused to accept discrimination as normal and had used her power to force accountability rather than simply seeking personal compensation for the harm she had experienced. Her shoulder still ached during changes in cabin pressure, a permanent reminder of the violence that had been inflicted on her for the crime of sitting while black, in a space where someone had decided she didn't belong, but the physical pain had been transformed into something meaningful through the systematic changes that now protected other passengers from experiencing similar treatment. As the flight continued through the night toward London, Diana allowed herself to feel satisfaction, not in the destruction of her enemies, but in the construction of a better system that valued human dignity over corporate convenience, that protected passengers rather than institutions, and that demonstrated the possibility of using power wisely rather than vindictively when confronting injustice that demanded more than individual solutions to address institutional problems. 2 years after the incident that changed everything, the Diana Crawford Passenger Rights Act became federal law, establishing comprehensive protections against discrimination in commercial transportation and creating enforcement mechanisms that made mistreatment of passengers both legally actionable and financially devastating for airlines that failed to maintain cultures of dignity and respect. Ashley Chen completed her transformation from someone who had enabled discrimination to someone who worked actively to prevent it, traveling nationwide as a trainer and educator who helped transportation industry employees understand the human impact of their assumptions and decisions. Brandon Whitmore's financial literacy program had expanded to serve over 500 young people in underserved communities, proving that redemption was possible for those willing to acknowledge their failures and commit to sustained service rather than seeking to restore their previous position and privileges. His work demonstrated that people could change when forced to confront the real consequences of their actions and offered meaningful opportunities to contribute to solutions rather than simply facing punishment for problems they had helped create. Officer Torres served 18 months in federal prison for civil rights violations and now works in community outreach programs, using his experience to help other law enforcement officers understand how unchecked authority and unconscious bias can destroy the trust between police and communities they are sworn to protect. Captain Hayes entered rehabilitation for alcohol abuse and became an advocate for pilot mental health programs, channeling his regret into efforts that supported his colleagues while acknowledging the harm his poor judgment had caused to innocent passengers. Diana's shoulder still aches when storm systems move through the region, a permanent reminder that dignity must sometimes be fought for rather than simply requested. But when she sees young professionals like James traveling confidently in spaces where they belong, occupying seats they have earned and purchased without fear of discrimination or harassment, she knows the pain was worth the transformation it helped to create. Power, she had learned, was not about what you could destroy when wronged, but about what you chose to build from the ashes of injustice, creating systems that protected others from experiencing the same harm, while proving that individual courage could generate institutional change when supported by strategic thinking and sustained commitment to universal human dignity. Thank you for watching this story of ultimate justice and corporate accountability. If you felt the satisfaction of seeing discrimination meet its match, please hit that like button to help our channel reach more people who need to hear stories about courage and transformation. Don't forget to share this video with someone who believes in standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult and expensive to defend principles that should be universal. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss new stories about justice, dignity, and the power of refusing to accept discrimination as normal. Let us know in the comments what you would have done in Diana's position, and remember that every time we speak up against injustice, we make the world a little more fair for everyone who comes after us.